Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. My name is Joshua Joushi Howard, and today we're going to be talking about Rough Riders. As of the April 2024 Militarum Field Manual, Rough Riders went down from 140 points to 120, but everything I'm going to say in this guide will be useful as it was still accurate when they were 140, and hopefully it will still be useful by the time we actually get our codex to come out. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about Rough Rider basics, the Armory. How are you supposed to be equipping your Rough Riders? Squad sizing. Should you be taking 5, 10, and then how many units should you be taking? How much damage do they actually do on the charge? Orders and stratagems you want to be using on these units and how you want to be using them. A couple of different ways to be using oval bases and strategy in general. So to start off with, here's how you need to be thinking about Rough Riders. Rough Riders are first and foremost damage and trade pieces. You use them very aggressively in order to kill things and remove people from objectives and take down important parts of your opponent's army that you are trying to prevent from scoring and or doing damage to you. Secondly, they are one of the best rapid ingress threats not just in the Guard Codex, but arguably in the entire game. For 1 CP, because they already moved 12, you can guarantee charges on the follow-up turn and really threaten a lot of targets. Rough Riders are also pretty surprising with the amount of utility that they provide with their weird base sizes and also the fact that they can fall back, shoot, and charge, and that they can move 12 inches or up to 15 inches with move, move, move. This means that they can be in a lot of places that they want to be at almost any time, and it really makes Rough Riders a valuable unit to your army. In general, you want to be deploying Rough Riders as aggressively as possible without them dying if you go second. This does mean that if you have some obscuring ruins in the middle of the board, you want to be behind those, but preferably on a lot of Games Workshop terrain, you want them to be behind ruins that you can run over, the ones that are 2 inches tall or less. And the last thing, you should be thinking about Rough Riders as a way to spend 3 command points to delete one thing from your opponent's army. The one thing I'll say about Rough Riders in general before we go any further is there's a lot of using Rough Riders that is counterintuitive to a lot of Guard players because we are so used to being such a strong shooting army. And while Guard is still a strong shooting army in 10th edition, we are actually also a very good melee army, and Rough Riders are a major part of that. So it has been a major learning curve for a lot of people to understand how effective these units are. There's going to be a lot of things about the charge and fight phases that we are not going to be covering in this guide, but if you become a better melee player in general, it will help you use Rough Riders hugely. So first off, how do you equip your Rough Riders? 99% of the time, you're going to want to equip all of them with hunting lances, and then you will give the sergeant a power saber. If your meta has a lot of marine equivalents, so these are going to be things like Space Marines and Hearthkin Warriors and Necron Warriors and some versions of Orc Boys, things that are generally about toughness 4, 2 wounds with a 3-up save, but toughness 5, 4-up save are in the same category. And arguably, you could even include Rough Riders themselves, toughness 4 with a 4-up save. You can consider including 2 gold lances. However, these tend not to be profiles that we really struggle into, and because of that, you usually really have to justify putting the gold lances. 99% of the time, you're going to be taking all hunting lances. Next, squad sizing 5 or 10. I would say that 80 to 90% of the time, you're going to be looking to bring Rough Riders in units of 10 for the 120 points as of this last MFM. However, they do provide slightly different roles. 5 Rough Riders is usually not enough of a punch to kill most vehicles, so they are mostly just used for clearing chaff. And at that point, I would arguably say that you should be looking at Deathcore Riders instead, because if you give them the character, they have the option to infiltrate and have a reactive move. And because of that, that's why 10 is usually the number that you will want to bring. They will kill or seriously hurt any target without an invul save, and it provides more of a rapid ingress threat. It also provides more value on the reinforcement stratagem as well. In general, if you're going to be taking Rough Riders, 1 is totally fine. 2 is also very nice. It's rare that you want to be taking more than 2, simply because you're going to run out of command points to support that many units. Rough Riders are a unit that ends up chewing up a lot of command points throughout the course of the game, and you usually do not have enough command points in order to justify having the 3rd unit, unless you're just willing to gamble on 9-inch charges. So similar to the Bullgren guide, it's important to understand how much damage Rough Riders actually do. And this chart currently shows how much damage they will be doing to a lot of targets with and without invuls. I've generally picked a number of profiles that you generally tend to see very often. So Devilfish is currently the tankiest of the transports that are out there at toughness 9 with 13 wounds, and you'll see that we kill them 70% of the time even without the fixed bayonets order. Other ones, they are going to put serious damage into an Armiger and a Leman Russ, but they aren't very likely to do nearly as much damage to something like a Rogel Thorn. Anything with a 2-up save, the 6-up save is a pretty big difference than having a 3-up save, and so those kinds of vehicles are going to be a bit more resilient. At the same time, Breachers has a Guardsman equivalent, Marines has a Marine equivalent, and of course Hearthguard has a Terminator equivalent, but one that does not have an invul save. Now, these are going to be targets that do have an invul save. A lot of them, you'll notice that the percentage to kill has gone significantly down. However, you're still doing a lot of wounds to them on average. You'll notice that even the Nemesis Dread Knight, you still have a 31% chance to kill. However, by the time you get up to something like Be'lakor, where he has just a lot of wounds and a 4-up invul save, it ends up chewing up a lot of damage. And even with Melta-Lances, because they are d6 damage, you will experience a fair amount of swinginess because of it. However, noting that your damage is going to be going significantly down doesn't mean you shouldn't charge them. Especially for lighter things like Striking Scorpions or Boys in Green Tide, you still want to charge them because you're going to be doing a lot of damage to them. You might even kill them outright. However, by the time you start charging into Terminators or things that can potentially clap you back on the swing back, that's where you start to be a little unsure about how much damage you want to do to them. You have to consider whether or not you're going to be giving your opponent extra free movement, or if you are going to be able to tie them up and leave them in combat for another turn. Next, let's talk about how you should be giving orders and stratagems to Rough Riders. The two most common that you're going to be using on Rough Riders is, of course, move, 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 and fix bayonets. Move, move, move should be your go-to order most of the time, especially on turn 1, because you have a lot of tools. You really want to guarantee that you get into your opponent, and so you can use this to improve charge range, and also you can just use it in general. Just having 15 inches of movement is incredibly valuable. However, the more fancy one that a lot of people are looking at is, of course, fixed bayonets, and this is just used to improve damage output. But just as we talked about in the Bullgren guide, you are more interested in guaranteeing that you are going to be landing the charge, because missing the charge with this unit can be devastating. Because it is such a binary, if you make the charge, you can do a lot of damage, but if you don't make the charge, then your horses tend to be stranded, and they will almost always die on your opponent's turn. But, as you can remember from a couple of slides ago, fixed bayonets can be the difference between some vehicles living and dying. So, there are ways to make sure that you can swap over from the move, move, move to fixed bayonets. The most common ways to do this are with Gaunt's Ghost. When they come down from reinforcements, they can give orders at the end of the movement phase. Officers that disembark from a Chimera or a Taurox can also do it, and then a Scion Militarum Tempestus command squad can all give orders in the movement phase, and this allows you to switch the move, move, move order to fixed bayonets, so you can oftentimes find ways to give yourself the best of both worlds. A couple other ones that might come up. One of the biggest things you can do with your Rough Riders is prevent them from battle shocking. The two ways that you generally try and do this are 1, duty and honor. Because it takes your Rough Riders from being Leadership 7 to Leadership 6, that goes from being about a 58% to about a 70% likelihood of making sure you actually pass on your Battle Shock test, which is a pretty significant difference. It's also very useful because you get +1 Leadership and +1 OC, so having OC2 Rough Riders you can use a lot of the time in order to just put 20 OC on an objective. One of the things that I did in my most recent game is I was going to be charging a bunch of Tau Breachers, but he had a bunch of Pathfinders behind them that I would not be able to get into because they were too far. And that was enough OC that if I did not use Duty and Honor to get enough OC onto the objective, my opponent would have still controlled it, and that is a massive difference. Insane Bravery does something very similar. You can use it to prevent Battle Shock, but again, remember this is a once per game stratagem. Both of these things you can use to make sure that your Rough Riders are not Battle Shocked, and you can force your opponents to kill you back by charging into targets that are going to swing back. Your opponent does not have a choice and must make their melee attacks back into you. And you cannot use the reinforcement stratagem on them when you are Battle Shocked, so this is a way in order to get them back. Also very important to remember, the rule of Rough Riders in the index is Horsemasters. This says that they ignore modifiers to their movement, but also can fall back and shoot and charge. Because they can fall back and shoot, they're eligible to do actions. Because they can fall back and charge, they're obviously eligible to charge and do more damage with whatever is left. The one thing I would add to this is remember that you can choose to take Desperate Escape tests in order to fall back through enemy models. It's not something that only happens when you're battle shocked. If you want to move your Rough Riders, you can get your Rough Riders very deep into enemy lines by choosing to take Desperate Escape tests, running them through your opponent's models, and getting them very deep into your opponent's backline. The other stratagems that you will be using on these guys a lot more, especially in comparison to Insane Bravery, which you can use once per game, reinforcements. Reinforcements for 2 CP, you can take your Rough Riders that just died, put them in Strategic Reserve. You're generally going to be using reinforcements 3 or 4 times per game, and that means that any trade you make with Rough Riders is not a trade of points, it's a trade of command points. Because of this, you can use Rough Riders in many ways as a, hey, I'm going to trade my Rough Riders for your tank because I'm going to get mine back, and that means for 2 CP, I'm actually going to delete that unit. Rapid Ingress is also something that you are going to be looking at with Rough Riders. Almost every turn, you have one in reserve. So in general, this happens 1 to 3 times per game. And you use this to set up easy charges on your next turn. Because you have to come in 9 inches away from something and you move 12 inches, you can virtually guarantee that you can charge into almost anything you want with the Rapid Ingress. The other major thing to do with this is, as long as your opponent does not have indirect, you can use Rapid Ingress to avoid enemy shooting, and I've heard a lot of people complain about Rough Riders just not being very effective because you have to run them up the board. You do not have to run them up the board, and this is how you avoid that. It is also important to remember that Rough Riders do have the grenade keyword. They are able to throw grenades. It's crucial to know that while, yes, these guys can fall back, shoot, and charge, you do not need to be eligible to shoot. That does mean that you can just run around, you can advance and still throw grenades, and it does allow you to be very aggressive with this. It allows you to chip hard targets and finish off low health targets. One of the things I love doing is because they have las guns that don't do a lot of damage anyway, you put them next to something that you're going to shoot with a larger tank or something that will actually do damage, you see how much damage you actually do to it, and then you're like, okay, well now I will chuck a grenade with this one horse that I have strung off from the rest of the unit. Something that does come up every now and then is Heroic Intervention. It is a 6-inch counter charge, but it is 2 CP. Now, you don't use this very often, but I have won games off of a Heroic Intervention where my opponent charged into something of mine for 2 CP. I was able to charge my Rough Riders into his unit, and it effectively got my Rough Riders an extra 11 or so inches of movement on my opponent's turn and also killed one of his infantry units. It doesn't happen all that often, like I said, but because you also have Rapid Ingress, you can look to set up opportunities and try and prevent your opponent from actually charging some of your units. The last couple of stratagems you really need to think about with the Rough Riders is, firstly, counteroffensive, commonly known as Interrupt. It is 2 CP, and after your opponent has swung with something on the board, you can pay 2 CP to make your Rough Riders go next. Now, you do not have the Lance keyword if your opponent charged you, but it is something to keep in mind. It's pretty easy for most opponents to play around it just because they should swing with whatever is in combat with the Rough Riders first to try and prevent the interrupt from coming through, but it is something that will come up from time to time because maybe they charge 2 different units of Rough Riders and you want to be able to swing with one of them before your opponent has an opportunity to swing into you. Lastly, Fields of Fire. It doesn't happen very often. It is 2 CP to chip your opponent's armor, shred it, make everything else in your army do an extra AP worth of damage. It's usually too expensive to just use by itself, but if you do have Ursula Creed around, for the same reason you can use the reinforcement stratagem on Rough Riders, you can also use Fields of Fire for them for free because they are a regiment unit. Okay, one of the things that make Rough Riders exceptionally good, and you can see with my reasonably painted Rough Riders, is the fact that they have oval bases. This allows you to do a ton of cool things, and I'll go over some of my favorite tricks with them here. Firstly, the flower formation. As you can see, every single one of these Rough Riders is eligible to actually make attacks into the Sentinel because the one that is in base to base with the Sentinel is in base to base with every single one of these others. I believe that 5 petals is the most that you can actually put on this particular base, but that is still a lot of guys that you can use to maximize damage on a single target. Additionally, because only one of these guys is actually based up into the Sentinel, that means that the other 5 of them are eligible to make pile-in and consolidate moves in order to still try and tag other things or just move around in order to set yourself up for future turns. One of the other big things you can do with their oval bases and unit coherency rules is make lines that are nearly 32 inches long that non-fly units cannot pass over. Now, you can't see the whole thing here, but you can see that it is a little bit more than 31 inches right here with 2-inch gaps between every single one. Remember, if you have a unit of more than 7, you do have to do what is called dog boning, where you have 2 at the end of each end of the line, and it will allow you to maintain unit coherency even when they are strung out to their maximum. An important thing to remember is you can use these units by putting them out in the open against melee heavy armies in particular. You can leave them in a spot where they will get charged, knowing that you're going to get them back in order to force your opponent's melee units to charge into them and leave themselves wide open so that your more aggressive shooting parts of your army can kill your opponent's back. The next trick I want to show all of you guys is the slingshot. In this particular example, this unit of Rough Riders wants to charge into the Leman Russ. However, the distance of charge is unreliable, so you don't want to go for that. But there is a way to get your Rough Riders into the Leman Russ, and that is by charging the infantry instead. Now, depending on what you roll, remember that every single thing that you roll, every model that can base must. However, you can prevent some of your models from basing the target by taking guys from the middle and the back instead. In this example, we've taken the guy in the middle and the guy on the bottom, and they have moved in such a way that they are preventing a lot of the rest of your models from basing the infantry. That means that every single one of those models, if they are not capable of basing, can move kind of however they want as long as they move closer to the closest enemy model. With this in mind, they can run past the infantry almost entirely. And because in 10th edition, once you have charged, you are still eligible to pile into units that you did not declare a charge into, all of these horses, or several of them, are going to be able to pile into the tank without having declared it as a target. This is a massive tool that you can use to abuse a lot of ways that your opponents think they're screening their own units, but they aren't actually doing so. You can also chip a lot of these light screens like infantry in order to get them into your opponent's side of the board. And by punching holes in their screens, you can set this situation up for yourself relatively reliably in some games. Now, these are two of my favorite tricks, but there are so many tricks that you can do with oval bases that I could not possibly cover them all in a guide and still have it be a reasonable length. In general, the things you're going to want to do is 1. Read through the charge and fight phase rules, really understand how charges, pile-ins, and consolidates work, and then look to use the length of the base to change what model they're closest to. Just because you are forced to base doesn't mean that the back end of the horse cannot swing to potentially be in closer to other things if you were to kill your target. Another thing that you can do is because they are long, you can turn your horses sideways such that they are able to create long strings of coherency. The same way we made that really long line is exactly the same way that we can create coherency between these two units. And you can use a relatively low number of models to create that string between both sides of your combat. Now, as I said towards the beginning, a lot of using Rough Riders is simply understanding the charge and the fight phase. There are a lot of guides on YouTube on how to do that properly, and this is not one of them. However, I would recommend you check out some of these other content creators, including Tactical Tortoise, 40k Dirtbags, and Happy Crumpin Wargaming for more general melee army tips and tricks, which are huge for playing Rough Riders. Yes, everyone, I understand that Guard is a shooting army. However, we do have strong melee elements, and understanding how to get the most out of them can be a massive difference between you going 1 and 4 at your next grand tournament and going 3 and 2. So lastly, let's talk about some of the general strategies and put together everything that we talked about before and actually showcase how they can all work together. The first way that you can use Rough Riders, that is the most general way that I will use them in most of my games, is I use them as reinforcements missiles. Like we said, Rough Riders are very good at killing things. They are very effective at killing chaff, so guardsman equivalents. These are guardsmen, gene stealer cults, Tau breachers, chaos cultists, and all manner of small toughness 3 things. You can use them to trade very aggressively, and it is okay to trade them for scoring pieces, even if you think, oh, that thing's not worth it. Because we are trading 2 CP to remove that unit instead of trading the Rough Riders points for them because we can get them back, it is okay to charge them into targets that you would not think are the best targets to charge them into. In general, Rough Riders are way better at controlling the sides of the board than they are at controlling the middle of the board this way, simply because, well, yes, 12 or 15 inches of movement is a lot. It is way easier to guarantee charges into things that you can get into range with the rapid ingress stratagem. And because of this, rapid ingress is one of your best friends. Like we said, you're going to be wanting to use rapid ingress on Rough Riders somewhere between 1 and 3 times per game. And again, once I've gone and killed something and died, you can do it again. That's one of the best parts about playing these, and generally how you play them on turns 3, 4, and 5 in a lot of your games. The other way that you're going to be using Rough Riders, especially on turns 1 and 2, is to use them as an alpha strike and a move block. This is best on the search and destroy deployment type because deployment zones are so close together. They are either 15 inches apart or 18 inches apart if you charge across the entire circle, meaning that anything that is on the line that goes up against your Rough Riders, depending on how your terrain is currently set up, can become a trivial charge. That means that you can almost always charge anything that your opponent is deploying aggressively, and you can really shut down a lot of what your opponent is trying to do. If you go first, remember you can charge and tag as many things as you can without your Rough Riders dying. The goal here is, one, yes, to kill something, but just as importantly, you want to touch as many things with horses to make sure that they cannot fall back and shoot, fall back and charge, or really have a lot of forward movement on their first and potentially second turn. This creates huge headaches for your opponents, and I can point to a number of games where I've done this to people and won the game on turn 1 because my opponent, who is relying on controlling a lot of the mid-board with their infiltrate and scout moves, now are no longer able to do so because they just got run down by the charge of the Light Brigade. Other important things to remember: this is most effective on search and destroy. It is second most effective on diagonal deployments, so sweeping engagement and Crucible of Battle, where deployment zones are about 21 inches apart, and it is least effective on Hammer and Anvil and Dawn of War because those deployment zones are 24 inches apart, meaning that anything that is still in your opponent's DZ, if you use move, 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 is at best looking at a 9-inch charge into the targets that it wants to get into. Lastly, one of the things that you can do a lot with horses is they are a fantastic counter charge unit. Into a lot of melee pressure armies like World Leaders, Orcs, or Demons, you already know that they're going to come to you. So you want to make sure that you let them charge something else so that the horses can charge back into them and get as much damage as possible, virtually guaranteeing that fixed bayonets is going to come into play. This means that Rough Riders pair very well, in particular, with units like Catachan, who are cheap screens, Bulgrin, who are very durable screens, and Chimeras, who a lot of units just really struggle to punch through because of how tough they really are. By using these units as your screens, you can nearly guarantee that your Rough Riders will get charges off very effectively. It's also okay to remember that Rough Riders can fall back and charge, so it's okay to let your opponents consolidate into you. It just means that everybody that is consolidated into gets to poke a little bit with their lances first. Overall, I hope this has been a useful guide for you in the Officer Training School on Rough Riders. Once again, I would like to give special shoutouts to the players who have helped me develop this guide. In particular, once again, Nick Jagello from Team Canada, also David Purcell, a strong player in the Southeast United States, and lastly, Paul Clifton, who was a strong contender for Team China at this year's WTC, for all of the insights they have provided into this guide. If you have any questions or clarifications that you're looking for about this guide, please go ahead and throw them down into the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this guide, please give a like, comment, and subscribe. If you are interested in seeing particular units or concepts in the guide come up in the next episode of Officer Training School, please let me know down in the comments as well. Once again, this has been the Officer Training School about Rough Riders. I am Joshua Joushi Howard. Good luck in your upcoming 40K games, and we'll see you all next time.